Hello, welcome back to another episode of Ancient History 101. I'm your host, Alexandra Sills, and for today we have a returning guest. You may remember way back in episode 2, we spoke to Owen Rees about Xenophon, which was such a good episode, and Owen is one of my favourite people. And as a bonus, he is the perfect person to talk about our topic of the day. We're going to be talking about Sparta today, and when we think about pop culture, Sparta is constantly present. Probably more so, I'd say, than Homer, although the recent spate of Odyssey films might have changed that. But we've all seen Sparta in pop culture. Movies like 300, video games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, God of War, Spartan Total Warrior, and in novels like Gates of Fire. Sparta is really popular in modern media. We see them all the time, so we think we know them. But do we really? Turns out the truth is a little bit more complicated. But don't worry, Ancient History 101 is here to clear it all up for you. Okay, so today we have a very interesting conversation, and we're going to be talking with our guest expert of the week. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, Dr. Owen Rees. I'm an ancient historian by background. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher these days. I teach on something called Applied Humanities at Birmingham Newman University. And I suppose for the topic of the day, the most important thing is I run a ancient history website called badancient.com that kind of brings together a network of specialists, yourself included, to fact check common claims made about the ancient world. And for the topic of the day, Sparta is very much our most popular topic.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And we will be digging into why. And I think to start off with, if I say to you, before I went to uni in my 30s, if I say to you what I thought I knew about Sparta, just to start off with, what I thought I knew was that they were ultra masculine, obsessed with the military. They always won the majority of their battles. Jared Butler kicked a black guy down a well, and their women were awesome. Then I got to uni, and I heard this term that I'd never heard before, the Spartan Mirage. And I realised, oh, okay, I've got a lot of catching up to do. Can you please tell me what the Spartan Mirage is?
Yours is a story I share myself. So, whenever anyone first encounters the concept of the Spartan Mirage, it's very rarely their first interaction with the Spartans. The Spartans usually come to us culturally, or indeed, for me, it was misspent teenage years in what I like to refer to as my historical rebellious phase, where I was just interested in cultures that were odd and strange. And so I fell in love with Spartans at that point. When 300, the film came out with Gerard Butler and that, this is exactly what I wanted Sparta to be.
Yeah.
On telly, doing what Spartans do best. Because this is the image that we kind of have projected onto us. Now, back in the 1930s, a scholar by the name of Francois Ollier came up with a brilliant piece of work which gives us our expression, the Spartan Mirage, in which basically he noted, as many had before, that all our evidence for Sparta comes from non-Spartans, especially in the classical period. So we're talking 5th and 4th century, the height of Spartan, the zenith of Spartan power, everything that we sort of caricature or these images we have of the Spartans as this uber militaristic society, all of that comes from non-Spartan sources.
Right, because ancient historians traditionally, before they relied, and they still, a lot of them don't rely a lot on archaeology, they relied heavily on texts, right?
Yeah.
So you're telling me that there are no texts written by a Spartan?
Not during the 5th and 4th centuries, no, not during this height. So the only real written evidence we have that probably were by Spartans are by two poets from the Archaic period. So that's sort of 7th century. So we're talking, 100, nearly 200 years before. A lot of the sort of Thermopylae smashing, Athenian destroying Spartans that we know, and I use the word love, tongue in cheek. So we've got two poets who even our ancient evidence can't decide if they're Spartan or not. We just know that the Spartans loved their songs and their poetry. Other than that, no, we have no surviving written evidence from the Spartans themselves.
So who's writing what we know about Sparta?
I mean, predominantly the Athenians, as is always the way with ancient Greek history of the classical period. So much of our evidence really only comes from Athens. There are exceptions, but as a general rule of thumb, Athens is where we're getting our information from. This is made particularly problematic when it comes to the Spartans, because the Athenians are very much the enemy of Sparta.
Yeah.
During much of this period. So it is a bit like getting your biography written for you by your worst enemy.
Who doesn't really know you that well, personally.
Who doesn't know you that well, or has no interest in portraying you in a correct manner. So we have the historians, Thucydides. Herodotus himself is from Asia Minor, so what we now think of as Turkey. Again, not Spartan. And we have a third historian by the name of Xenophon. Again, Athenian. He at least knew some Spartans. We know that.
He'd met some.
Yeah, he met some. He spent time with Spartans. He even spent time in Spartan armies. So out of all of them, he at least has a close affiliation with the Spartans. But he himself is not Spartan.
Okay.
Other than that, we're using the philosophers. So we're thinking people like Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon again, and also the dramatists. So the comedians and the tragedians of Athens, who again are writing for the Athenian audience.
Right, okay.
Predominantly. So when we talk about the Spartan Mirage, what Ollier was talking about with the Spartan Mirage was the fact that his focus was on people who very much liked what the Spartans were doing in this period. So people like Plato seem to be quite interested in what the Spartans are doing and seem to, as a general rule, seem to think quite positively of their political structure and their sort of ideas of governance. So he's sort of focused on that. And then the Spartan Mirage as a concept grew, and we started to look at negative representations of the Spartans. So again, the caricature from a negative perspective, and then this evolved again and again and again. Because ultimately what the Mirage is the reality when we're talking about the Spartans. When you're talking about the Spartans, you're not talking about anything that is necessarily true. It is much like a mirage, and it is an illusion. And it's an illusion from our sources written by other people. And it's sort of learning to navigate that. So when we talk about the Spartan Mirage, sometimes it's to shut down ideas we don't like because it's an easy way of doing it. And other times it's just sort of dismiss something and move on as, oh, well, they probably just made that up. That's the Mirage in action. But scholarship since the turn of the millennium has really started to kind of scrutinize what the Mirage looks like, how it changes over time, because different cultures, different receptions of the Spartans do different things with the Spartan culture and push it forward as either this great thing or this evil thing, depending on what's going on in their own sort of time context, in their own situations. So what's the Mirage? I guess that's all the Mirage in all its different entities. But ultimately, the key thing is when we come to Sparta, what do we actually know from the Spartans themselves when it comes to the written texts? Not a lot.
Right, okay. So the text that we do have by people like Thucydides, can we tell if Sparta was a kind of open community where foreigners would be welcome to walk in, have a chat, find out, or are they writing about something that they haven't actually experienced? Did they get close enough to be able to back up what they were saying?
Well, this is the million-dollar question with sources like Thucydides. That's why I mentioned Xenophon, because Xenophon we can trace to, yes, he spent time in Spartan land. He went to Laconia. He literally gets given a house by the king of Sparta at one point once he's in exile from Athens. He spent time there. There's even rumours by later sources. One of our other issues is not just Athenian sources, it's usually later Roman sources as well, Roman period sources that write about Sparta. They seem to suggest that his sons might have even gone through the famous agoge, which is the Spartan educational system, the so-called brutal upbringing.
Yeah, we see it in the 300 movie, right?
Yeah, where he hunts a wolf.
Yeah.
It's all very manly for a 10-year-old. So Xenophon might well have put his children through that, but that's a much later tradition. So Xenophon, we're more than happy to go, yes, he has an understanding of the Spartans he's talking about. If he contradicts all other contemporary sources, I personally would be more tempted to believe Xenophon than I would anyone else.
Okay, that's really important, right?
Yeah, so Thucydides, as the flip side, we know Thucydides is exiled from Athens at some point during the Peloponnesian War, the big war between Sparta and Athens and their allies. But we don't really know how much time he spent with Spartans. We don't know if he went there or if there's even a suggestion he went there. We don't really know how close his connection with the Spartan system, Spartan people was, which is frustrating. if he has spent time with them, that'd be really useful to know.
Yeah.
And it would mean
Wouldn't
we can interpret it, Thucydides very differently.
Yeah.
So we're sort of left to sort of second guess ourselves. So in that respect, this is the other thing where we're trying to work out, did these writers have an understanding of Sparta? Are they at least presenting things that are potentially true? Or is this entirely hearsay? Is it entirely based on military interactions and suppositions and, like I said earlier, like caricatures? They're talking to a particular audience and they're presenting Sparta in a particular way. It can be quite frustrating to navigate those questions. And then add to that, as I said, probably our best evidence for the Spartan culture in terms of the amount of it and the detail of it is Plutarch, who is writing 500 years later.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge gap of time.
A huge gap, absolutely enormous gap of time. He is basically doing what any writer now would be doing if they were to write about the Tudors of England. Now, that's not to dismiss Plutarch. Plutarch is a scholar. He's a good researcher. He's not bad at what he does. One, he's not a historian. He's predominantly a biographer and a moralist.
Yeah.
So he's interested in moral stories to kind of understand human behavior, human virtue, whatever you want to call it. And he's also just interested in the sort of stories that are building up. But he does seem to have gone to Sparta. But of course, that's the Sparta of 500 years later.
In the Roman period, right?
In the Roman period, precisely that. So again, he is the most detailed with people like Lycurgus, the so-called lawgiver of the Spartans. He gives us biographies of various Spartan kings. He gives us the famous works where he collected famous sayings of the Spartans, famous sayings of Spartan women. How much of this is oral tradition? How much of this is folklore? How much of this is fantasy at this point? We don't really know, but they are interesting. There's no denying it. But yeah, so oddly enough, in terms of detail, I used the best in a very loose term, but here's our best source in terms of quantity, I suppose.
Okay.
Him and Xenophon.
So one's quality and one's quantity.
I like to think so.
Yeah,
but I am a defender of Xenophon.
What are the main misconceptions that started floating around from this period that we now know maybe aren't really accurate?
Well, I suppose there's a few misconceptions, and some of them are from the evidence, and some of them are from how the evidence has been interpreted. But the biggest misconception is that Sparta is this warrior society in which it has embedded throughout its entire culture militarism, that it has a standalone force, an army that is professionalized, and that is all Spartans do. In terms of the classic misconceptions of the Spartans, it is that they are professional warriors and that they are unique amongst the Greeks for being that.
Gerard Butler lied to me.
Yeah, the classic, Spartans, what is your profession? It's because our evidence does suggest this.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. The later evidence very much suggests this. There's this idea that the Spartans were banned from holding any professions and the like. And often this all comes down to oversimplification of Spartan culture. So when we talk about Spartans, who are we actually talking about? Who we're actually talking about are the elite Spartiates. These are the citizens of Sparta. They are the people who go through the agoge, go through the educational system, and are the people we envisage when we think of the Spartans, with the red capes and the 8-packs and the rippling biceps and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of who we visualize as the Spartans. But when we talk about Spartan armies and we talk about the Spartan military, they're only a small part.
Ah, okay.
Because the Spartan army is made up of Spartiates, these citizens, in smaller numbers. The perioikoi, so these are the people who live around Sparta, but don't hold full citizen rights. So they're not enslaved. So they're free, but they don't hold all the rights of a Spartiate.
So it's like an underclass.
Yeah, predominantly. And then we've also got the Helots, who are the enslaved Greek communities living in Messenia and Laconia as well. So they do not have their freedom at all. And these people sort of make up the building blocks of Spartan society. So when we talk about the Spartans, you've got to be very careful as who is it we're actually talking about when we talk about Sparta. So when you say Spartans can have no professions, you are probably talking about Spartiates, the elite at the top. At their largest, we hear of about 8,000 of them. And then by the end of the Peloponnesian War and into the 4th century, there's like 1,000 of them.
Okay, because it's quite a large population, but it's a minority that get all
Yeah.
the attention, right?
Precisely that.
Yeah.
Precisely that. Which is no different. And I suppose that's the thing that always gets me about the Spartan Mirage. That's no different to any other ancient Greek culture. Like our understanding of ancient Athens, ancient Athenian culture, from the literary sources, is predominantly elite culture.
Yeah.
There's not a lot on the poor. And if it is, it's often written by the rich, talking about the poor. There is an argument that Spartan exceptionalism is overblown. And actually, this is something a historian by the name of Stephen Hodkinson has argued for many years, that we have over-exaggerated how unique Sparta is. And when you start to poke holes at other ancient Greek societies, you realise that a lot of the same things that we're talking about in Sparta do occur elsewhere and are not unique. So again, that would be another aspect of the Mirage, the idea of Spartan exceptionalism.
That they were unusual.
Yeah. I should point out, not everyone agrees on that.
Oh, okay.
That is debated. But Stephen Hodkinson in particular is the voice that pushed this at its most extreme.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that they weren't that unusual. They weren't that obsessed with fighting. They weren't particularly successful from the battles that I've read. They lost quite a few of them.
They lose more than we talk about. They do. Well, their most famous battle is a defeat. So the Battle of Thermopylae, the Great Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans alongside 7,000 other Greeks and probably 1,000 other Spartan non-Spartiates also fought at. That is a defeat. Leonidas' Great Stand is a glorious defeat.
And we will be having a full episode on the Battle of Thermopylae in the future because it is just so interesting.
It is interesting. And so much of the Spartan Mirage is born from that story.
From that one day. Wow.
That one day. So even to the point where the ancient Greeks are starting to build it themselves. So it's not just a modern phenomenon. So there's a story in the Peloponnesian War where the Spartans end up surrendering on the island of Sphacteria. A small number of Spartans surrender, and it sends shockwaves through the Greek world because Spartans never surrender. That's the story. Spartans never surrender because of Thermopylae.
So essentially, everyone else not really knowing what's going on in Sparta itself, the myths that surround it, is in itself creating this really great PR campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, precisely that. There's a historian, good friend of mine, Roel Konijnendijk, who basically makes this argument that the mythos around Sparta becomes a weapon it uses. And that basically, when you look at a lot of Spartan battles, quite often armies don't stand and face them. So it's almost like the battle has been won before they've entered the field. So it's in Spartan military interests to maintain this sort of mystique about themselves and the idea that if the Spartans are there, no one else can face them. No one else is able to match them and combat them. But if you, like you said, if you look at the full Spartan military record, it's not 100% victory. They do lose.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is interesting. But we get to the point where, like in Syracuse, they have one Spartan turn up to help them protect the city during the Peloponnesian War against the Athenians. And whilst they're a bit disgruntled that the Spartans only sent one man,
one guy,
there is still this impression that, yeah, but he is a Spartan. So
he's worth 10.
Yeah, this might do something. And he does. He then is supposedly the mastermind of protecting Syracuse. And we get similar stories throughout, the idea that even a small number of Spartans is enough to make a psychological impact.
Wow. So in other words, they're all bark, not necessarily all bite. And it's not even them that's doing a lot of the barking. They're letting everyone else do it for them.
To an extent. I think this is probably me going too far the other end. When I talked about the different ways of looking at the Mirage, where, because ultimately when you look at some of the battles that the Spartans win, they can do things on a battlefield that no other Greek army seems to be as comfortable doing because of their rigid hierarchy within their military, which is a little bit unique. Not as unique as you'd think, but it is a little bit unique. And their ability to pass messages quickly between officers, basically, means that they have close control of the infantry in particular, which means they can maneuver on a battlefield in a way that other Greek armies, not necessarily that they can't, but that they don't really try. Because if it goes wrong, it will go catastrophically wrong. So they generally don't try like wheeling maneuvers of flanks and things like that, but the Spartans do. So yes, we overblow how exceptional they are. However, that exceptionalism isn't born from nothing.
There's a little kernel in there.
There is a little kernel of that, and ultimately, the Spartans do win some major battles, and it's because of their ability to do things or to stand the ground on the battlefield that other armies just don't seem to be able to do as comfortably or as easily. Having said all that, the Athenians seem to be just as good. So,
Right. The difference, of course, is that the Athenians are writing pages and pages and pages of text about how great they are that we can read and that we've been preoccupied with in our discipline for centuries.
Indeed.
I could go on for hours about how obsessed everyone is with Athens. So for ancient historians working today then, we've already established that we don't have the texts we might want or expect from other places to help us in our research. The text that we do have, we need to approach with a lot of caution. So how do you, as an ancient historian, try to build up an accurate picture of Sparta and without the usual methods of evidence that you would usually use? How can we do it? Is it possible?
Oh, that last question was a difficult one.
Oh.
So I was going to answer that until that last question. Is it possible? No, I don't think it is. What are historians doing? What historians are doing really well at the moment is unpicking our assumptions and actually trying to refocus in on the evidence itself.
Okay.
What does the evidence actually say? So, for instance, one of the things that's come out in the research most recently is a lot of our evidence for the Spartans is that they are not full-time soldiers at all, and that they are a leisured elite class. So this is really clear when you start to look at the stories in Xenophon, Thucydides, Herodotus, and stop looking at it through the lens of these are uber warriors who can smash anyone, and actually look at what are the stories that we're being told. What are the Spartans up to in the stories we are being told? In almost like the background, what's going on in the scenery of the main story. So, there's stories of like conspiracies in Sparta, and as you read the story, you suddenly realize that there are Spartans in the Agora shopping. There are people just hanging out, having a nice time in the gym, as in the gymnasium, doing things that elite Greeks do.
All across the Greek world.
All across Greek world. And they're not doing what we would sort of expect professional soldiers to be doing. So they don't live in a barracks. And the other thing is they've really worked hard to reassess the different strands of evidence, written evidence. When I mentioned Plutarch, writing 500 years later, Plutarch will mention his sources sometimes. So he'll tell us who he's reading.
Always very helpful.
It is really helpful because he had access to books and to works that we don't have access to.
Yes.
So if he can tell us who it is and we know it, he's often paraphrasing or quoting accurately.
So we can trace the knowledge
So we
back.
can trace back. Yeah. So when he mentions other writers, so for instance, there's a historian called Ephorus, who we don't really know, and we've got writers like Plutarch and Diodorus of Sicily who sort of mention him and then are clearly paraphrasing his work. We don't have that work. So if we can trust this writer's account of that work, we then have access to another source nearer to the time period that we don't really have. So that can be really helpful, but it takes a lot of picking apart and a lot of philological work, so the study of the language, study of the words themselves, and also manuscript traditions, which is the most boring phrase I ever learnt at university.
You said it.
Which is the idea that when you go and buy a translation, you're going to like a bookshop and you'll pick up like a Penguin translation or, an Oxford Classical World translation of a text. We all make the same mistake, which is this is what Xenophon wrote. And a good translation will have at the beginning a introduction which talks you through something called the manuscript tradition, which is basically the different versions of the oldest versions of this work. So for simple terms, what is the oldest version of Xenophon's Hellenica that we have? How many different versions of that do we have? And how have they brought these different versions together to create this translation? And often what you'll find is the oldest versions we have are not ancient. They might be medieval.
Yeah. Copied by a monk.
Yeah, it could be like, the monks in sort of Byzantium or wherever it be have kept it going because ultimately they have chosen works that they think hold value or hold philosophical teachings that are compatible with the church or, whatever it be. They have made selections along the way. So the other thing we have, it's not just a Spartan Mirage, it is an ancient history Mirage, is the idea of survivor bias.
Yeah. We've been given what has been deemed important. We've not been able to make the choice ourselves.
Precisely that, which is why you want to be skeptical when people tell you that, a play by Euripides is the greatest work he ever did, because we don't have every work he ever did. The philosophies of Aristotle are the groundbreaking platform by which the ancient Greek world relied upon. We don't know that. We just know that later writers liked him.
Right.
We don't necessarily know what everyone else thought of him at the time.
Yeah.
My favourite for that really is Socrates.
Yes.
Sorry, we're going on a tangent.
We are
This
going
is
on
the
a tangent.
ADHD kicking in.
It's fine.
But my favourite for that is Socrates. If you look at the work of Plato, Xenophon, these are Socrates' students. Socrates is the grandfather of all European philosophy. He is the basis by which all of European thought can exist afterwards. It is him. He is the guy. And this is the kind of tradition that we've inherited. I mean, they didn't say as extreme as that, but this is very much the one we've inherited since. So we think of Socrates very much as the beginning of European philosophical traditions in many ways. Whereas our evidence for Socrates outside of his student body is that he was a bit of a crackpot.
Yes. I mean, yeah, I was shocked to learn about all of this.
So we have the comedies of Aristophanes, in which he is presented exactly like that. And this kind of gives us a little insight into how skewed our evidence can be and how different a perspective it can give us when we have another piece of evidence from that same time period. So when we don't have that evidence, it's very easy for us to go, this is how it was. Whereas we've always got to keep in the back of our mind how poor our evidence always is. And we've got to keep in the back of our mind that actually we don't know much else. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, whether it's the Spartans or anyone else.
Yeah. So it's always important to think about not only what someone is saying, but who they are, because who they are is going to influence what they're saying, why they're saying it, who they're talking to.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other one. It's the audience. Audience is always a big one.
When Xenophon and when Plutarch are talking about Sparta, who is their audience?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So Xenophon is predominantly writing to other elite Greeks. So he himself is an elite Athenian. He's writing to other elite Greeks. We know things like he wrote a eulogistic biography of the Spartan king Agesilaus II. He wasn't his patron, but he was someone that Xenophon knew. I mentioned that a king gave him a house.
Okay.
That was Agesilaus II.
So his chums.
Yeah, and his biography of him is very carefully worded. It's very carefully chosen, creating the impression that he's a concerned Spartans might read this, or that people who like Agesilaus might read this. So we can kind of discern things like that. On the same token, he's also writing for audiences like the Athenians. And in Athens, the relationship between elite Athenians and the Spartans is a difficult tightrope that people like Xenophon are walking. Because if you like the Spartans too much, you might be considered a Spartan supporter or potentially what's called an oligarch or an oligarchic supporter. So someone who is anti-democracy.
And of course, Athens in the 5th century BC
is a democracy.
Yeah.
And in the 4th century the beginning of the 4th century had just regained its democracy after Sparta had imposed oligarchic tyranny called the 30. So after that, there was a real sense of who is a Spartan lover, who is a supporter of the Spartans, who is secretly wishing we had the kind of oligarchic plutocracy, so the rule of the wealthy, the rule of the rich. Who wishes we had that instead of democracy? This is where the kind of the witch hunt over people like Socrates, this is the sort of background to that as well. So someone like Xenophon, even if he's not saying it, even if he's not necessarily in Athens at the time, this is also something else he's trying to navigate.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be seen as a traitor.
Precisely.
Okay.
Especially as we think he might have been exiled from Athens for being in the Spartan army and marching against an Athenian army.
So he's already,
So he's already
thin
on
ice.
very thin ice.
Yeah.
Precisely that. So whereas Plutarch's a completely different matter.
Yeah, because he's got half a millennium.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to worry about that.
Plutarch's not worried about any of that. Plutarch is writing predominantly biography. So the story of Lysander, the story of Agesilaus, the story of all these big names from Spartan history come to us through Plutarch's biographies. And his biographies, like all biographies are not history. This is a misconception. All readers of history, all boring people who read far too much about history and history methods, Biography is not history. Biography is the recording of life. It's a different thing. And I'm not dismissing that because I think it's amazing. I love biographies. I love to read them because they're fascinating as an insight into an individual. Now, that individual doesn't have to be the historical figure. With Plutarch, that individual is Plutarch himself.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah. So Plutarch uses the stories. He contrasts a Greek and a Roman, what's called the parallel lives. So he picks a Greek and a Roman who he thinks have very similar life stories or seem to go through similar difficulties. They go through similar experiences. And he likes to compare and contrast them. And the whole thing really is about him. It's called it's moralistic writing. He's trying to basically find out why things went wrong, who did good, who did bad, what went wrong, why it went bad, and what does that tell us about how to, not necessarily to live morally, but that's kind of an undertone of, making these decisions and being guided by the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things. And he's kind of exploring this. So when we're reading something like the life of Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver of Spartans, we are also very much exploring Plutarch's research into the right way of trying to set up a city or the laws of a city. When we're looking at Agesilaos, we're looking at the story of how someone could take Sparta to its heights, which is the largest empire ever held, and to oversee its collapse with the defeat of the Thebans through the life of Agesilaos and the sort of the errors along the way. So his inability to adapt, his stringent clinging to tradition when tradition wasn't working anymore. These are kind of themes through the works of Plutarch that perhaps we do see it in Xenophon, but it's less explicit because of that close connection Xenophon had with him.
So again, we will be doing an episode on the parallel lives because they're fantastic.
They are amazing.
But for now, is it fair to say that if you're approaching any one of Plutarch's biographies in isolation, including a Spartan, you've got to keep in the back of your mind what he's writing about that matching Roman that he's paired up with them?
Yeah, precisely that. And often, not every time, when he does his comparative lives, he then writes a mini essay comparing them.
So we have to keep them, we can't read them in isolation. We have to keep that in mind.
As a bare minimum, you would read his life, whoever's life it is, you would read the life and then you would read that comparative essay.
Okay, so that's a pitfall for students that they have to avoid. You have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, you've got to take into consideration. Otherwise, you're just, I don't even know what the comparison will be, but it's no different to then just ripping a page entirely out of context from a book and turning it into something else.
Okay, so we've talked about what the Spartan Mirage is. We've talked about how modern scholars are challenging it and picking it apart, which is fascinating work and it's really important work. I would like to rewind a little bit to, for instance, the 20th century. Can we see the Spartan Mirage being used, whether knowingly or not, to contribute negative misappropriations even now? Can we see the fact that in the general public, let's say, these myths are still floating around? You know it, I know it, we're fighting them all the time.
Yeah.
Can we see specific instances, famous instances of the Spartans specifically being evoked to push modern shitty ideology?
Yeah, we certainly can. So the classic example that keeps going around at the moment, and I say this in the context of news of yet another mass shooting in the US, which is on gun rights. So one of the battle cries of gun right activism in the US is molon labe, which is an ancient Greek phrase meaning come and get them, which comes from our favourite battle of the Spartans, Thermopylae. And it is predominantly in Plutarch, where the story comes that basically the Persians are asking the Spartans to surrender, I've got a massive army, you're all going to die, what's the point of this? Lay down your weapons. And this is where Gerard Butler, rather manly and profusely, declares, come and get them. And this has sort of been used as the bugle call for gun rights in the US, because ultimately, if you want to take their guns away, you need to come and get them, with the inherent threat of violence that is underpinning that as well. This is actually not a contemporary ancient Spartan story. It is only really in Plutarch.
Writing 500 years later,
500 years later. And there's various different ways you can look at it, but ultimately it's not from our main story of Thermopylae at all, which is Herodotus of Halicarnassus' account, probably inserted later. Also just little things like if we visualize 300 and its telling of that story, you have Leonidas shouting this defiantly, If you read Plutarch, it's actually a written exchange of letters,
Oh, okay.
so less dramatic.
Gerard Butler's lying to me again.
I know,
Damn it.
he's letting the team down.
Ugh.
But he's got a nice accent, so it's fine.
Yeah, the accent is what I'm focusing on.
Indeed. It's what the Spartans famously had, that accent. So the flip side of it is ultimately they've ripped it out of context. So even if we leave it in the context of Plutarch and we accept Plutarch's story as plausible, it's plausible.
Yeah.
It's just not reliable, but it's plausible. We can also start to prod at the idea of, okay, so even if this was said in a battle context and within the context of lay down your weapons, come and get them, act of defiance, we're going to fight this out now. Fine. That's not the same as the Spartans approving of gun control or open carrying of weapons. Now, there's a really fascinating series of blogs written by Stephen Hogginson, the person I mentioned earlier, the emeritus professor at Nottingham. He wrote a series of blogs on basically, would the Spartans have approved of open carrying of weapons?
Ooh.
And again, it's kind of picking apart the evidence, trying to find any evidence of the Spartans having weapons when they're walking around Sparta or in their military camps when they're on campaign and things like that. And his conclusion is no, they wouldn't have.
Wow. So that goes against the image that we have of them being armed to the teeth all the time because they're constantly training.
Yeah. And I suppose if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because if you've got a potentially hostile group of enslaved population, large enslaved population of the Helots, who you're also kind of concerned that they might rise up at any moment. If you're walking around heavily armed, they can get hold of that. So in many ways, you want to control where the weapons are. You want to control how easy it is to access weapons. And it's not a good idea to be openly carrying weapons around.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So it's just interesting. It's speculative, but I found them quite convincing on that matter. So Molon Labe is sort of a classic example of that, where it's been entirely blown out of proportion, and it's been used originally as this act of defiance. Fine. Probably didn't happen, but doesn't really matter. You're allowed to be inspired by history, so let's not rip that from people. And it is an amazing story in its own right. But the idea that it's now being used to justify other political views that are completely removed from Spartan life, Spartan culture, or anything, and the idea that you are somehow now a modern Spartan resisting this, resisting oppression, because that's ultimately what this is doing. You're likening yourself to the Spartans fighting against the supposed tyrannical oppression of the Persian imperial court. A whole load of other ancient myths in that story, by the way, but we're not doing that today. But that's the idea. That's who you're aligning yourself with, and it's nonsense. The other one, which is apparent throughout the 20th century and still comes up today, is the idea that the Spartans practiced an extreme form of eugenics.
Yes.
Now, you might be surprised to hear me say extreme eugenics.
Well, anyone who's played Assassin's Creed will know about the eugenics idea.
Well, indeed. Yeah. So, absolutely. So, predominantly the story goes that the Spartans would judge their children after birth, and if they were found to be weak, sickly, crying, whatever it be, they would be thrown off a cliff and killed.
Wow. Yeah.
And the idea being that only the strongest can survive. This was also used to justify anti-disability eugenic ideas as well, especially in the 20th century. And Sparta was sort of looked to as an example of a state that was doing it right, that they were not allowing weakness into their bloodline.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see the nasty elements of what we have. And the Nazis, the Nazi party in early 20th century Germany, are the most extreme version of this.
Of course.
They are not unique.
Just
I think sometimes we like to talk about the Nazis, and the Nazis had a bit of an obsession with Sparta, partly because of things like this. And we often point to them as like, oh, and then the Nazis did this, and the Nazis thought that, and isn't this, it's horrific, and the Spartans kind of linked with the Nazis. It's not just the Nazis who were doing this. It's just the Nazis really attempted to almost emulate a lot of these ideas as well.
So they're just taking it a bit more extreme than other people.
To an even further extremity because of the power and control that they held in their own situation. So the Spartans have sort of been used to kind of justify these ideas as an example of a pure ethnic state.
Oh, yeah.
And that's long-standing. And it's built on ideas like this. It's built on the idea of their marriage laws and whether or not basically married women could basically have sexual relationships with other Spartans if their own husband couldn't give them more children and all that kind of stuff. It's the idea of whether Spartan women were educated and well-fed and given athletic training so that they would produce better babies. So we've got this idea of Spartan society trying to produce, for want of a better word, perfect human specimens. And this is the ideology of what's picked up with these stories. Now, taking the example of babies being thrown off the cliff, the epitome of that eugenics practice, there's no reliable evidence for it at all. So the main evidence comes from Plutarch,
who again, 500 years later,
who we've talked about, and all the evidence, all the archaeological evidence. Remember that?
Yeah.
All the archaeological evidence.
Yeah, philologists, the archaeological evidence.
To be fair, I can't say the archaeological evidence disproves it. It doesn't. That's not how archaeological evidence works in this case. But there is no archaeological evidence of the excavations around where these things were supposed to be occurring that supports it at all.
You'd expect to find something, but there's nothing to corroborate it, so we can't. Okay.
No. So there are excavations around the pit in which they were supposed to have been thrown into, and they found human bodies, but they found no human bodies under the age of 18. So it kind of confirms an idea that this might be where they killed prisoners, traitors, that kind of thing. But there's no evidence of them killing children there.
That's interesting. And it should be mentioned as well. Our upcoming episodes will be featuring an episode on disability in the Greek world, and that will be coming into it as well. So
Precisely
what I'm
that.
hearing is the Spartans, we don't know much about them because they weren't saying anything themselves. We're relying on hearsay. Some of it's reliable, some of it's not. And that the Spartans themselves benefited from the kind of secrecy. What I'm hearing as well is that even all these centuries later, that secrecy and the kind of myth-making around them is still benefiting groups who want to promote certain ideologies. For instance, Americans who are so obsessed with being able to carry a gun that they are willing to sacrifice children in school shootings, and they are using material just like in the ancient world. So the Spartan Mirage isn't just a problem for ancient historians. It's a problem for pretty much everyone who's living in a modern society.
Yeah. Just to kind of give you an idea of just how wide this spreads. It's really easy and simple because it's the ones people will understand best to focus on extreme right usages of the Spartans. But you could point this to lots of different areas. So, for instance, there is a belief among many groups that Spartans were the first communist society.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't sound like anything I've read. No.
Oh, there's a Bad Ancient article by Stephen Hodkinson about debunking this.
Yes, and that will be linked in the episode description for everyone to read.
So, yeah, because Sparta is, according to some models, a communist state. It was not. It had two kings, for God's sake. At any one time, I should point out. Not there's only two kings ever. It had two kings at any one time, the so-called diarchy. There's other ones where early waves of feminism was using Spartan society to argue about freedom of women. And that Spartan society is a good example of almost a, not proto-feminist, but, this kind of liberated society for women, which again is just not what the evidence shows at all. Although an angry and rather misogynistic Aristotle does kind of paint this image.
Oh, what a shocker Aristotle comes up with that. Jesus Christ.
It is not just the far right. So, yes, the Nazis are the most famous example of it, but it's been used time and time again by lots of different groups to kind of justify themselves or to vilify something. So, this is ultimately the Mirage. The Mirage is not a single thing that you just study and understand. The Mirage is ever evolving. And if we're perfectly honest with ourselves, we create our own Spartan Mirage when we start to write about the Spartans as well. Because we're not really, this is when you ask me, can we get past this? Can we solve this? And my answer is no. We need an insertion of evidence, the likes of which we have nothing existing. So we need something so new and so radically different to what we have. This is, to be fair, occurring archaeologically as the excavations in Sparta and the collections in Sparta are being catalogued better and better. And we're getting a better insight into the art, into the architecture, into the buildings, into the commemoration, into the funeral rites, into all these different things. So we are getting a different image of Sparta. We're getting an image of Sparta that actually wasn't afraid of money, that wasn't belittling of affluence, shiny, pretty things. that actually they did like what you and I might think of as the finer things in life, but that does not always necessarily match the ideology of the Spartans. And to be perfectly frank, name a society in history where the ideology and reality actually line up.
Exactly. So this is what we have to bear in mind, right?
Precisely
So
that.
if someone is reading about Sparta for the first time, or, is a student writing an essay, what do you think are the essentials that we have to bear in mind when we're reading or writing anything about Sparta?
First thing to keep in mind is if you're reading any scholar, so you're reading any scholarship whatsoever, keep in mind, how does he know that? That's the question. How do they know that? I had a chat with Stephen Hodgkinson once. Stephen Hodgkinson, Paul Cartledge, Jean Ducat, these are the big names of
Yeah,
Spartan
they're the
studies
big dogs, right?
of the past 40 plus odd years, wherever it is. We're getting a new generation coming through now. So in terms of the sort of established scholarship, these are the kind of names you're going to read a lot. I was having a chat with Stephen Hodgkinson, and he said one of the reasons he loved the Spartans, the reason why he studied the Spartans, is because he could read every single source we have about the Spartans in like a year.
Yeah, that's an insanely short amount
Well,
of
to
time.
be honest, you could do it even less time than that. And that was why he loved it. So something I like to do with my students whenever we go into the Spartans is we'll do a topic. So we haven't talked about like something called the crypteia, which is this idea of a secret police going around killing all the helots. In a seminar, so a 1 hour session, I could get students to read every single piece of evidence we have about the crypteia.
Yeah, in one seminar.
In one seminar, we could read all of them. And once you've read all of them, you know as much as every world-leading expert in Sparta.
Oh, okay.
So when you are then reading Hodgkinson, Cartledge, Sarah Pomeroy, whoever it is, you can then go, well, hold on, I've read all that too. And I love that about the Spartan history. I love that you're in a position where you can do that. So don't be afraid when you're reading the scholarship to kind of go, well, how do you actually know that? And then you look at the evidence and you go, okay, so you're quoting a marginalia, which is a piece of writing along the side of a manuscript written by someone we don't know, probably writing about 600 years later than the event they're talking about, if not more. You're like, well, I don't think that's okay. And then you can kind of have those thoughts. Sparta is an amazing entry point to the ancient world and the study of the ancient world because it empowers you from the beginning to engage with the evidence, engage with the scholarship, and not feel overawed by it.
And that is what I want everyone listening to this, whoever you are, whatever your level of experience. You've got an expert here telling you that you can do this to a decent level.
You absolutely can. And the other thing to remember with the scholarship is no one agrees.
Yeah.
Like, no one agrees at all. Not even a little bit. So I've talked a lot about Stephen Hodgkinson. I'm strongly influenced by the words of the work of Stephen Hodgkinson. I grew up reading Cartledge. I don't agree with either of them.
Yeah. Okay.
They don't agree with each other.
And that's okay, right?
Precisely that. It's precisely that. Other thing with the evidence is whenever you're reading evidence about the Spartans, ask the question of when was this written?
Mm-hmm.
What does the earlier evidence say about this topic? Does it say anything at all? And then go from there. And then you've got a decision to make. And I then bring you back to my first point. If you've read all the evidence, you're in as much of a position to make that decision as any academic.
Which is wonderful. It's wonderful to hear that anyone can do this. All they need is a little bit of reading and a little bit of thinking.
Precisely that. Yeah, precisely that. And then what the scholarship does is it becomes a guide. It becomes a guide to ideas. It becomes a guide to models. And then you explore those models yourself, deepen the knowledge that we are all working within a mirage and that we are all wrong. We just don't yet know who's more wrong.
It kind of takes the pressure off, doesn't it?
It does. I love it. This is why I talk about all ancient history as a mirage.
Yes. Yeah. Takes the pressure off of all of it. You could have told me that before I wrote the book. For goodness sake. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think everyone will agree that was a pretty fantastic episode. Thank you so much, Owen, for coming to talk to us about the Spartan Mirage.
No, thank you so much for having me on.
We will be inviting you back, and you better come back because this is
I've no doubt.
Good. So there you have it. Nothing about Sparta is as simple as it seems, but it is a lot more mysterious. And I think because they presented such a blank canvas that they just let everyone else scribble upon, that's why the movies, games, and books that we read about them today, well, they make a lot of stuff up. And it turns out we can't really blame novels, video games, movies for making stuff up about Sparta, because even professional historians just don't have a lot to work with. And some of what they're working with was made up too. So ancient Sparta is going to have to remain a mystery, but I really hope that this episode has explained why that's the case. We have linked loads of supplementary material down below. The episode, as usual, has its own webpage on our website, ancienthistory101.org, where we have put images, links to recommended books, maps, all that kind of thing. And if you want to know more about Owen and his work, that's all on there as well. We have a lot more coming in the next couple of weeks, so make sure you hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And we'd love it if you followed us on social media and gave us some feedback about what you enjoy about the show. I genuinely love hearing comments from you, so keep them coming. Ancient History 101 is produced and hosted by me, Alexandra Sills, and the show is part of the Mnemosyne Memory Collective, a friendly group of creators, educators, historians, all of whom are passionate about making learning about the ancient world feel accessible and engaging. So why not check out some of our sister shows? In the meantime, thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.